The community center's main hall had never been so silent. Uncle Rick's voice, usually loud with his know-it-all opinions, caught in his throat as he stared at the large projection screen. Around him, 43 members of the Martinez family sat frozen in their folding chairs, eyes wide with disbelief. The keynote speaker they'd been waiting to hear from was walking onto the stage, and it wasn't some stranger they'd never met. It was me. I was 200 miles away in my hotel room, in downtown Phoenix, adjusting my dress uniform one final time before the ceremony. My phone buzzed with notifications from the family group chat I'd muted hours earlier. Message after message of shock, confusion, and what I could only assume was panic. Wait, is that really Sofia? How is this possible? Did anyone know about this? I smiled, straightening my ribbons and checking my reflection. After 22 years of military service, 3 deployments, and more achievements than I could count on both hands, my family was about to discover that their peeked-in, high school disappointment had been living a life they never bothered to ask about. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, about to address 3,000 veterans and their families at the Southwest Regional Veterans Excellence Awards, while my own family sat in disbelief at their annual reunion, finally seeing me for who I really was instead of who they assumed I'd become. My name is Sofia Elena Martinez, and I'm 40 years old. To my family, I've always been the quiet one who joined the military right after high school because I couldn't figure out what to do with my life. The one who never came to family gatherings because I was too busy playing soldier. The one who, according to my cousin Maria's memorable comment last Christmas, peaked when she was captain of the volleyball team and has been trying to recapture that glory ever since. They had no idea that their aimless relative had spent the last 2 decades building a career that most people only dream about, that I'd earned my master's degree while deployed in Afghanistan, that I'd led humanitarian missions in 3 different countries, that I'd been personally commended by generals whose names appear in history books, that I'd saved lives, changed policies, and earned respect from some of the most decorated military leaders in our nation's history. But why would they know? They never asked. Growing up in Tucson, I was always the odd one out in the Martinez clan. My cousins were loud, social, and seemed to have their lives figured out by age 16. Maria was the beauty queen who married her high school sweetheart and had 3 kids before she turned 25. My brother Carlos was the golden boy, who took over Dad's construction business and bought the biggest house in the neighborhood. My sister Anna became a teacher, which everyone praised as such noble work every chance they got. And then there was me, quiet Sofia, who spent more time reading than gossiping, who preferred hiking alone to shopping with the girls, who asked too many questions and never seemed satisfied with simple answers. The family worried about me, they said. I was too serious, too intense, too focused on things that didn't matter. When I announced I was enlisting in the Army, the reaction was exactly what I expected. My mother cried like I was dying. My father shook his head and muttered about wasted potential. My aunts whispered among themselves about how some people just needed to learn things the hard way. Uncle Rick, never one to keep his opinions to himself, declared that the military was where people went when they couldn't make it. In the real world, it's not a career, mija, he'd said, gesturing with his beer bottle for emphasis. It's just something you do until you figure out what you really want to be. That was 22 years ago. I wonder what Uncle Rick would say now if he knew that. The something I did had taken me to 37 countries, earned me 2 Bronze Stars, and landed me in the Pentagon working on international defense policy. I wonder what he'd think if he knew that generals sought my opinion, that I'd briefed senators, that my decisions had impacted military operations across 3 continents. But he didn't know, because he never asked. None of them did. The thing about military life is that it creates a distance that goes beyond geography. You're not just physically removed from your family during deployments. You're emotionally removed from their day-to-day concerns that suddenly seem trivial when you've seen what real problems look like. While my cousins worried about their kids making the soccer team, I was coordinating medical supply drops to earthquake victims. While they complained about their commutes to work, I was managing logistics for operations that kept people alive. That distance made family gatherings increasingly uncomfortable. I'd come home on leave, and within hours, I'd remember why I'd left in the first place. The conversations were the same. The assumptions about my life were the same. The subtle dismissal of my choices was the same. Last year's Christmas gathering was particularly brutal. I'd just returned from a 6-month deployment to Eastern Europe, where I'd been part of a joint task force working on refugee assistance programs. I was exhausted, emotionally drained, and probably not in the best headspace for family drama. But I went anyway, because that's what you do. The evening started normally enough. The usual questions about whether I was still in the military and when I was going to settle down and start a real life. I deflected with vague answers, as I always did. The military had taught me that some battles aren't worth fighting, and family gatherings weren't the place for detailed explanations of my actual work. But then Maria, 3 glasses of wine into the evening, decided to get philosophical about life choices. She was holding court at the kitchen table surrounded by my female cousins, dispensing wisdom about marriage and motherhood with the confidence of someone who'd never questioned her path. "The thing is," she said, glancing my way, "some people peak early and spend the rest of their lives trying to get back to that high. Like, remember how amazing Sofia was at volleyball in high school? She was going to get a scholarship, maybe go to state, be somebody important." She paused dramatically, clearly enjoying her audience. But then she chose the military instead, and now look. 40 years old, no husband, no kids, still playing dress-up soldier, like she's trying to recapture her glory days. It's kind of sad. "Really?" The room went quiet. My cousins shifted uncomfortably. My mother busied herself with cleaning already clean dishes. My father found something fascinating about his phone screen. I could have said something. I could have explained that. I'd turned down that volleyball scholarship because I wanted to serve my country. I could have mentioned that I'd earned my master's degree in international relations, while most of them were still figuring out their majors. I could have told them about the medal I'd received just 3 months earlier for my work on a humanitarian mission that had saved hundreds of lives. Instead, I smiled politely and excused myself to the bathroom, where I stood in front of the mirror and wondered why I kept subjecting myself to this. That's when I made the decision that would change everything. I was done trying to fit into their idea of who I should be. I was done minimizing my accomplishments to make them comfortable. I was done pretending that their definition of success was the only one that mattered. I was also done telling them anything about my life that they hadn't bothered to ask about. Which brings us to today, and the Southwest Regional Veterans Excellence Awards ceremony that I'd been selected to keynote. The same ceremony that was being broadcast live to community centers across the region as part of Veterans Appreciation Week. The same ceremony that my family's reunion planning committee had decided would be inspiring for everyone to watch. Together. They had no idea that their peaked-in-high-school disappointment was about to take the stage as the evening's featured speaker. They had no idea that I'd been chosen for this honor because of achievements they'd never bothered to learn about. They had no idea that in about 10 minutes I was going to step up to that podium and share the story of a military career that had taken me places and shown me things they couldn't imagine. My phone buzzed again. Another string of messages in the family chat. I could see the preview of Uncle Rick's message. Wait, how did Sofia get invited to speak at? I turned the phone face down and took one last look in the mirror. My dress uniform was pristine, my posture confident, my expression calm. This wasn't about revenge or proving anyone wrong. This was about finally, after 40 years, being seen for who I actually was instead of who they assumed I was. The irony was perfect. They'd gathered to watch an inspiring speaker talk about veteran excellence, expecting to hear from some accomplished stranger. Instead, they were about to discover that the accomplished stranger had been sitting at their dinner table all along, invisible because they'd never thought to really look. 20 minutes from now, I would step onto that stage and begin my speech with words I'd been preparing my entire military career. Excellence isn't about meeting other people's expectations. It's about exceeding your own, even when no one is watching, especially when no one believes in you. I had no idea if my family would understand the message, but I knew they'd finally hear my voice, not as the quiet disappointment who'd never lived up to her high school potential, but as Colonel Sofia Elena Martinez, United States Army, recipient of the Distinguished Service Medal, and tonight's keynote speaker at an event honoring the very excellence they'd spent decades telling me I'd never achieve. The community center was about to get very loud, and Uncle Rick was about to learn what making it in the real world actually looked like. I wasn't always the family disappointment. There was a time when the Martinez clan saw potential in me, when my future seemed as bright and predictable as everyone else's. That time ended the day I graduated from Desert Vista High School and announced I was enlisting instead of accepting the full ride to Arizona State University that everyone expected me to take. But let me back up and tell you who I really am, because clearly my family never bothered to find out. My full name is Sofia Elena Martinez, and I'm the middle child of 3 born to Roberto and Carmen Martinez in Tucson, Arizona. My father built houses for a living, sturdy adobe homes that could withstand the desert heat and monsoon rains. My mother worked as a school secretary, the kind of woman who knew every kid's name and somehow always had Band-Aids and kind words ready when needed. They were good people who worked hard and loved their family, but they were also people who believed there was one right way to live life, and deviation from that path was viewed with suspicion and worry. Growing up, I was the kid who asked too many questions. While my siblings were content to accept that things were the way they were, I wanted to know why. Why did some families in our neighborhood have so much while others had so little? Why did news reports talk about wars in countries I couldn't even pronounce? Why did my grandmother whisper prayers for people she'd never met who lived in places she'd never seen? My curiosity drove my family crazy. At Sunday dinners, while my cousins gossiped about school drama and my brother talked about sports, I'd pepper my grandfather with questions about his time in the Korean War. He'd served for 2 years, came home, and rarely spoke about it. But something in those brief moments when he'd share a story, something in the way his eyes would get distant and serious, made me want to understand what service meant. The Martinez family has always been about tradition and predictability. My father followed his father into construction. My Uncle Rick took over the family auto repair shop. My cousins married young, had babies, and settled into lives that looked remarkably similar to their parents. There's nothing wrong with that path, but it felt suffocating to me. I wanted something bigger, something that mattered beyond our little corner of Tucson High School was where I first started to stand out, and not always in ways my family appreciated. Yes, I was good at volleyball, damn good actually. Senior year, I was team captain, and we made it to the state semifinals. College scouts were interested, and Coach Rivera spent hours helping me navigate scholarship offers. Arizona State University offered me a full ride, and for a few weeks, it seemed like my future was set. But even as I excelled on the volleyball court, my real interest lay elsewhere. I joined the debate team, which my family saw as a waste of time. I volunteered with a local organization that helped refugee families resettle in Tucson, which made my aunts worry I was getting too involved with other people's problems. I read voraciously about international affairs, history, and political science, subjects that seemed utterly impractical to relatives who believed success meant finding a good job, getting married, and buying a house before you turned 30. My junior year, a military recruiter came to speak at our school during a career fair. Most students walked past his table without a second glance, but I stopped and listened. Staff Sergeant Jennifer Coleman was her name, and she talked about opportunities in the Army that I'd never considered. Leadership training, international, assignments, education benefits, and the chance to serve something bigger than yourself. I picked up the brochures, but didn't say anything to my family. Not yet. The idea grew on me slowly, like a seed that had been planted and was finally getting the right conditions to sprout. I started researching military occupational specialties, looking at officer training programs, reading about career paths that could take me around the world. The more I learned, the more convinced I became that this was my path, not the volleyball scholarship and college route everyone expected. The night I told my parents about my decision remains one of the most difficult conversations of my life. We were sitting around the dinner table, and I'd been working up the courage for weeks. My acceptance letter to Arizona State was sitting on the kitchen counter, and everyone kept asking when I was going to send in my enrollment paperwork. "I've made a decision about college," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. My mother looked up from her plate, smiling. "Oh, good, mija. Coach Rivera said you need to decide soon about the scholarship." "I'm not taking the scholarship. I'm not going to college. I'm enlisting in the Army." The silence that followed was deafening. My father set down his fork so hard it clinked against his plate. My mother's face went pale. My brother Carlos, home from his first year of college, stared at me like I'd announced I was joining a cult. "What, do you mean enlisting?" my father asked, his voice dangerously quiet. I had prepared for this moment, had practiced my explanation dozens of times in front of my bedroom mirror. I talked about service, about wanting to make a difference, about the educational opportunities the military offered. I mentioned that I could study international relations, that there were programs that would help me become an officer, that this could lead to a meaningful career in foreign service or international development. My father listened to all of it, then shook his head slowly. "Sofia, you have a full scholarship to a good university. You have a chance to play volleyball at the college level, maybe even professionally. You have opportunities that most kids would kill for. And you want to throw it all away to play soldier? It's not playing soldier, Dad. It's serving my country." "It's wasting your potential," my mother interjected, tears already forming in her eyes. "Mija, the military is for kids who don't have other options. You have options. You have talent. You have a future." That conversation lasted 3 hours and got louder and more emotional as it went on. Uncle Rick, who happened to stop by during the middle of it, made his opinion clear. "Sofia, listen to me. I've known plenty of kids who joined the military thinking it was going to be some great adventure. You know what happened to most of them? They did their 4 years, came back with nothing to show for it, and had to start over from scratch while their friends had already established careers and started families. The military isn't a career, it's a detour." My extended family's reaction was even worse. At the next Sunday gathering, the news had spread, and I found myself the center of unwanted attention. My aunts looked at me with a mixture of pity and disapproval. My cousins asked questions that sounded more like accusations. "Why would you want to go to some foreign country when you could stay here with your family? Don't you want to get married and have children someday? What happens when you get hurt or traumatized or something?" The assumption underlying all of their concerns was that I was making a mistake, that I was throwing away a safe, predictable future for something dangerous and uncertain. They couldn't understand that the safe, predictable future they wanted, for me, felt like a prison. They couldn't see that I was choosing purpose over comfort, growth over security. My grandfather was the only one who didn't try to talk me out of it. The afternoon before I left for basic training, he pulled me aside on his back porch, the same porch where he'd told me stories about Korea when I was little. "Your family means well, mija," he said, his weathered hands folded in his lap. "But they don't understand what it means to serve. I do. It changes you, but if you're meant for it, it changes you for the better." He reached into his pocket and pulled out something small and metallic. It was a challenge coin from his old unit, worn smooth from decades of being carried in his wallet. "I want you to have this," he said, pressing it into my palm. "Not because I think you need luck, but because I want you to remember that some of us understand why you're doing this." That conversation meant everything to me, especially during the dark moments of basic training when I questioned whether I'd made the right choice. When my drill sergeants pushed me beyond what I thought were my limits, when I was homesick and exhausted and wondering if my family had been right, I'd hold that challenge coin and remember that at least one person understood. Basic training at Fort Leonard Wood was brutal and transformative in ways I couldn't have anticipated. The physical challenges were obvious, but the mental and emotional growth was what really mattered. I learned that I was stronger than I'd ever imagined, not just physically, but mentally. I learned to lead, to follow, to work as part of a team, toward goals that were bigger than any individual contribution. More importantly, I learned that I was good at this, not just competent, but genuinely talented at military life. My drill sergeants noticed. My fellow soldiers noticed. I was selected for additional leadership responsibilities, recommended for advanced training, and by the time I graduated, I knew I'd found my calling. My family came to my graduation ceremony, and I could see they were proud, even if they still didn't understand. My mother cried when she saw me in dress uniform. My father stood a little straighter when other parents complimented them on having such an impressive daughter. For a moment, I thought maybe they were beginning to see what I saw in military service. But that feeling didn't last. When I called home with news about my first assignment, about the additional training I'd been selected for, about the commendations I was earning, the response was always the same polite interest followed by questions about when I was coming home for good. They supported me because they loved me, but they never truly understood that I wasn't just serving time until I could return to real life. This was my real life. Over the years, as my career progressed and my achievements accumulated, my family's attitude evolved from concerned disapproval to benign neglect. They stopped trying to talk me out of staying in the military, but they also stopped asking detailed questions about what I was doing. When I called home, they'd ask if I was safe and healthy, then quickly move on to talking about my cousins' new jobs, my siblings' latest accomplishments, or family drama I couldn't relate to because I wasn't there to witness it. The distance wasn't just geographical. It was cultural, experiential, emotional. How do you explain to people who've never left Arizona what it's like to coordinate humanitarian aid in a war zone? How do you share the pride of being selected for a special assignment when your family thinks all military jobs are basically the same? How do you convey the significance of being promoted ahead of your peers when your relatives see rank as arbitrary military pageantry? I stopped trying to bridge that gap, and they stopped asking me to. We settled into a comfortable pattern of surface-level communication that let everyone pretend we were still close, while acknowledging that we'd grown apart in ways that couldn't be easily fixed. That's how I became the family disappointment. Not through any dramatic falling out or major disagreement, but through the gradual accumulation of distance and misunderstanding. I became the relative they worried about, the one whose life didn't make sense to them, the one who'd chosen an inexplicable path and seemed determined to stick with it, despite all evidence that she should come home and settle down like everyone else. They had no idea that their disappointment was building something extraordinary, something that would eventually make them see her in an entirely different light. The pattern started small, almost imperceptibly, like most forms of being taken for granted do. It began during my first enlistment when I'd come home on leave and somehow become the family's go-to problem solver, the one they turned to when situations required someone responsible and reliable. What I didn't realize at the time was that I was being typecast into a role that would follow me for the next 2 decades. It started with my cousin Elena's wedding disaster in 2005. I was 23, barely 2 years into my military career, home on a brief leave between training assignments. Elena, Maria's younger sister, was getting married in 6 weeks when her wedding planner disappeared overnight, taking most of the deposit money with her. The family was in full panic mode when I arrived home, and somehow everyone looked to me to fix it. Sofia knows how to organize things, my Aunt Isabella said with the confidence of someone who had never planned anything more complex than a birthday party. She's in the military. They teach them how to handle logistics, right? I should have said no. I should have explained that my training in supply chain management didn't exactly translate to flower arrangements and catering coordination. Instead, I spent my entire 2-week leave calling vendors, renegotiating contracts, and somehow pulling together a wedding that Elena still talks about as the most beautiful day of her life. The family was grateful, of course. I received hugs, thank you cards, and promises that they'd never forget how I saved the day. But what I also received, though I didn't recognize it at the time, was a reputation as the person who could handle impossible situations when everyone else panicked. 2 years later, it was my brother Carlos who needed rescuing. He'd gotten himself into serious financial trouble, the kind that comes from trying to expand a construction business too quickly without proper planning. He was facing bankruptcy, potentially losing the house he'd bought with his wife Jennifer, and my parents were beside themselves with worry. Again, all eyes turned to me. I was stationed at Fort Bragg then, working in logistics coordination for overseas deployments. My family seemed to think this made me some kind of financial expert, which it didn't. But it did mean I knew how to research problems thoroughly and create systematic solutions. I spent weeks of my off-duty time reviewing Carlos's books, negotiating with creditors, and helping him restructure his business model. The solution worked. Carlos kept his business, saved his house, and eventually thrived. But what struck me was how quickly everyone moved on once the crisis was over. There was no acknowledgement of the nights I'd stayed up late working on his problems, no recognition of the expertise I'd developed during my military service that made me capable of helping. I was just Sofia, doing what Sofia does, fixing things, so everyone else could get back to their normal lives. This pattern repeated itself over and over throughout my military career, each incident reinforcing my role as the family's unofficial crisis manager. When my cousin Miguel got arrested for driving under the influence, I was the one who researched lawyers and helped navigate the legal system. When my Aunt Rosa needed someone to handle the complex insurance claims after her house was damaged. In a flash flood, I became the family's insurance expert overnight. When my teenage nephew started getting into serious trouble at school, I was expected to intervene because you know how to deal with discipline and structure. Each time, I told myself I was helping because that's what family does. Each time, I pushed aside my own plans, used my leave time or vacation days, and threw myself into solving problems that weren't mine to solve. And each time, once the crisis passed, life returned to normal for everyone except me. The requests became more frequent and more presumptuous as my military career progressed. My family had created a mental picture of my life that bore no resemblance to reality. They seemed to think that because I was single and in the military, I had unlimited free time and no real responsibilities. They couldn't grasp that I might be busy with my own career, my own challenges, my own life. During my first deployment to Iraq in 2008, I received a panicked call from my mother about my cousin Danny's wedding. Apparently, the best man had backed out 3 weeks before the ceremony, and Danny was devastated. Could I talk to him? Could I help him figure out what to do? Could I maybe even fly home to fill in since I wasn't doing anything important anyway? I was literally coordinating supply convoys through active combat zones. But sure, let me drop everything to counsel a grown man about wedding party logistics. The most frustrating part wasn't the requests themselves, though they were increasingly unreasonable. It was the complete lack of understanding about what my actual life looked like. When I tried to explain that I couldn't take emergency leave for non-emergency family drama, I was met with hurt feelings and accusations that the military had changed me, made me cold and uncaring. When I mentioned that I was working on complex projects with real deadlines and serious consequences, my family acted like I was exaggerating the importance of my work. "It's not like you're a doctor or something," my Aunt Carmen said during one particularly frustrating phone conversation about why I couldn't immediately solve my cousin's housing crisis. "Military work can wait. Family comes first." The irony was that my military work often involved life and death decisions, but because my family didn't understand what I actually did, they dismissed it as less important than whatever domestic crisis was currently consuming their attention. By my second deployment, I had developed strategies to protect my time and energy. I stopped answering every phone call immediately. I learned to say no to requests that would interfere with my duties or my limited rest time. I tried to establish boundaries that would let me maintain relationships with my family without becoming their unpaid problem-solving service. This didn't go over well. Suddenly, I was being difficult. I was letting the military change me in bad ways. I was putting my job before my family, as if that was somehow a character flaw, rather than a professional responsibility. The situation reached a breaking point during my third deployment to Afghanistan. I was working on a complex humanitarian aid distribution program, coordinating with international organizations and local leaders to ensure supplies reached remote villages safely. The work was demanding, dangerous, and personally fulfilling in ways I struggled to explain to people who had never seen poverty and desperation on that scale. In the middle of this assignment, I received an urgent email from my sister, Anna. Our cousin Patricia was getting divorced, and it was messy. Child custody issues, property disputes, accusations flying in both directions. Patricia needed someone to help her navigate the legal system, research her options, and provide emotional support during what was obviously a difficult time. The email was long, detailed, and ended with a sentence that revealed everything about how my family viewed my life. "I know you're not doing anything too important over there, and Patricia really needs someone with your organizational skills to help her get through this." Not doing anything too important. I was managing aid distribution that literally kept people alive, but that wasn't important compared to my cousin's divorce proceedings. I didn't respond to that email for 3 days, not because I was too busy, though I was, but because I needed time to process the casual dismissal of work that meant everything to me. When I finally replied, I tried to explain that I was in the middle of a critical project phase and couldn't provide the kind of intensive help Patricia needed, but I offered to connect her with resources that might be useful. The response was swift and painful. Anna accused me of abandoning family when they needed me most. My mother called, crying, saying she didn't understand what had happened to her daughter who used to care about other people. Even Patricia sent a hurt message about how disappointed she was that I couldn't spare time for family. None of them seemed to consider that I might have my own stresses, my own challenges, my own professional obligations that couldn't be set, aside whenever someone else had a problem. None of them acknowledged that maybe, just maybe, their crises weren't automatically more important than my career. The expectations had become so ingrained that my family couldn't see how unreasonable they'd become. They expected me to be perpetually available, infinitely patient, and endlessly capable of solving problems that they couldn't or wouldn't handle themselves. When I failed to meet these expectations, I wasn't just unavailable. I was selfish. I wasn't just busy, I was cold. I wasn't just focused on my career, I was abandoning my family. This dynamic created a vicious cycle. The more they demanded of me, the more I resented the demands. The more I tried to establish boundaries, the more they saw me as someone who had been negatively changed by military life. The more they dismissed my work as unimportant, the less I wanted to share details about achievements and experiences that actually mattered to me. Over the years, I became the family member who could be counted on to help in a crisis, but who was also somehow always disappointing them by not helping enough, not being available enough, not prioritizing family enough. I was simultaneously indispensable and inadequate, needed and criticized, relied upon and resented. The role was exhausting and thankless. Every success I had in helping solve their problems just raised the bar for what they expected next time. Every boundary I tried to establish was seen as evidence that military life had damaged my character. Every attempt to explain my actual responsibilities and achievements was met with polite disinterest or subtle skepticism. What hurt most was the gradual realization that they didn't see me as a person with my own dreams, challenges, and accomplishments. They saw me as a resource to be utilized when needed and ignored when not. My promotion to sergeant was less important than my cousin's job interview. My deployment to Eastern Europe was less interesting than the local high school football teams. Playoff chances. My master's degree was nice, they supposed, but when was I going to use it to get a real job? I had become the family's utility player, brought in when they needed someone competent and reliable, then benched until the next crisis arose. The saddest part was that I had allowed this to happen, had enabled this dynamic by consistently dropping everything to rescue people who never reciprocated when I might have needed support. But they had no idea that their utility player was quietly building a career that would eventually make their local dramas seem trivial by comparison. They had no idea that the person they took for granted was earning recognition and respect from people whose opinions actually mattered in the larger world. They had no idea that their pattern of exploitation was creating resentment that would eventually have consequences they never saw coming. The family problem solver was about to become their biggest surprise. The call came on a Tuesday morning in March 2018, while I was sitting in my office at the Pentagon reviewing briefing materials. For a meeting with the Deputy Secretary of Defense. I'd been working there for 8 months, having been selected for a coveted position in the International Security Affairs Office, but my family knew none of these details. To them, I was still just in the military somewhere in Washington. My phone buzzed with my mother's ringtone, and I almost let it go to voicemail. We were 3 weeks away from a major NATO summit, and I was buried in preparation work that could affect international defense policy for years to come. But something made me answer. Maybe the nagging worry that comes with having family members who only call when something is seriously wrong. Mija. Thank God you answered. My mother's voice was tight with stress. We have a situation with your grandfather. My stomach dropped. My grandfather, the one person in the family who had understood my choice to serve, had been battling cancer for 6 months. The family had been keeping me updated, but the news had been cautiously optimistic. Apparently, that had changed. The key. Doctors say he has maybe 2 weeks, my mother continued, her voice breaking. He's been asking for you constantly. He wants to see you before it's too late. I closed my eyes, feeling the familiar weight of family crisis settling on my shoulders. But this wasn't like the other times. This wasn't about someone's wedding or financial troubles or relationship drama. This was about the man who had given me his challenge coin, who had understood why I chose service over safety. I'll be there, I said without hesitation. I'll catch the first flight I can get. But what about your work? Can you just leave like that? It was such a revealing question. After 17 years of military service, my mother still didn't understand that the military has compassionate leave policies, that we take care of our own when family emergencies arise. She still thought of my job as some vague, flexible thing that could be abandoned whenever convenient. Mom, the military understands family emergencies. I'll be there tomorrow. What I didn't tell her was what I was walking away from to make this trip. The NATO summit preparation wasn't just busy work, it was career-defining responsibility. I was one of 3 officers tasked with developing the briefing materials that would guide American policy discussions with our most important allies. The Deputy Secretary had specifically requested my analysis on Eastern European security concerns based on my deployment experience and advanced degree in international relations. But my grandfather was dying, and some things are more important than career advancement. I spent the next 4 hours rearranging meetings, delegating responsibilities, and ensuring that my absence wouldn't derail critical preparation work. My supervisor, Colonel Patricia Hayes, didn't just approve my leave. She insisted that I take as much time as I needed. "Family comes first, Martinez," she said, using the no-nonsense tone that had made her one of the most respected officers in the Pentagon. "We'll handle things here. You focus on what matters." It struck me how different this conversation was from the ones I'd had with my family over the years. Colonel Hayes understood immediately that I might need to be gone for an extended period. She didn't question whether my grandfather's condition was serious enough to warrant emergency leave. She didn't suggest that maybe I could handle family business remotely while continuing to work. She understood that sometimes you have to make sacrifices for the people you love, and she respected my choice to make that sacrifice. The flight to Phoenix gave me 6 hours to think about my grandfather and what he meant to me. He was 84 years old, a Korean War veteran who had spent his post-military career as a high school history teacher. He was the one who had taught me that service comes in many forms, that there's honor in dedicating your life to something bigger than yourself, whether that's defending your country or educating the next generation. When I arrived at the hospital, I barely recognized the man in the bed. Cancer had stolen at least 40 pounds from his frame, and the chemotherapy had taken his hair and much of his energy. But his eyes lit up when he saw me walk into the room. "There's my soldier," he said, his voice weak but warm. "Look at you, all official in your uniform." I had worn my dress blues for the flight, partly out of respect for the seriousness of the situation, partly because I wanted him to see me as the soldier he had helped inspire. The uniform drew stares and thank yous from strangers in the airport, but it meant most coming from him. "I'm so proud of you, mija," he whispered as I took his hand. "I know the family doesn't always understand, but I do. You're doing something important." That conversation lasted 3 hours and covered 17 years of military service that I had never been able to discuss in detail with anyone in my family. My grandfather asked specific questions about my deployments, my training, my responsibilities. He wanted to know about the places I'd seen, the people I'd helped, the challenges I'd overcome. For the first time in years, I found myself talking openly about my work. I told him about coordinating humanitarian aid in Afghanistan, about the villages we'd helped rebuild, about the children who now had access to clean water because of programs I'd managed. I told him about my role in international security policy, about briefing senior officials on threats and opportunities that most Americans never heard about. He listened to everything with the intensity of someone who understands that these might be among our last conversations. When I mentioned my current assignment at the Pentagon, his eyes widened. "You work at the Pentagon? My granddaughter works at the Pentagon?" "I do. I'm part of a team that advises senior leadership on international security issues." He was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. "Does the family know?" I shook my head. "They know I work in Washington. They don't know specifically what I do." "Why not?" It was a simple question with a complicated answer. How do you explain to a dying man that his family had spent years making it clear they weren't interested in the details of your life? How do you say that you'd stopped sharing because sharing felt like casting pearls before swine? "They've never asked," I said finally. My grandfather squeezed my hand with surprising strength. "Then they don't know how extraordinary you are." I spent the next 2 weeks in Tucson, splitting time between the hospital and my parents' house. My grandfather's condition deteriorated rapidly, but he remained alert and engaged almost until the end. We talked about everything: service, family, legacy, the choices we make, and the prices we pay for them. During one of our last coherent conversations, he asked me about my plans for the future. "I'm being considered for promotion to colonel," I told him. "If it goes through, I'll probably be offered command of a training facility, or maybe a policy position at the State Department." His face lit up with pride and something else. "Maybe vindication. Colonel Sofia Martinez," he said, testing how it sounded. I like that. It's not definite yet, I cautioned. It will be, he said with absolute certainty. You've earned it. 2 days later, while I was sitting beside his bed reading him passages from a history book about the Korean War, my grandfather passed away peacefully in his sleep. I was holding his hand when it happened, and for a moment, the room felt filled with something larger than grief. The funeral was a revelation in ways I hadn't expected. My grandfather had been more connected to the veteran community than I'd realized, and his service drew dozens of former students, fellow veterans, and community members who spoke about his impact on their lives. I listened to story after story about a man who had quietly influenced generations of young people, who had never boasted about his service but had lived his values every day. During the military honors portion of the funeral, I stood at attention as the honor guard folded the flag that had draped his coffin. When the ceremony concluded and they presented the flag to my grandmother, she immediately turned and handed it to me. "He would want you to have this," she said simply. The gesture wasn't lost on my family members, who watched this exchange with expressions I couldn't quite read. My grandmother had chosen to honor me, the family's military member, with the most sacred symbol of my grandfather's service. It was recognition of something they had never quite acknowledged, my continuation of his legacy of service. But even that moment of recognition was fleeting. Within hours of the funeral, family conversations had returned to the familiar patterns. My cousins talked about their jobs, their children, their local concerns. My siblings discussed business prospects and social plans. The profound loss we had all experienced somehow became background noise to the resumption of normal family life. What struck me most was how quickly everyone expected me to transition back to my role as the family problem solver. Before my grandfather's body was even buried, my Aunt Isabella was asking if I could help my cousin Roberto with his college application essays. My sister Anna wondered if I might have time to review the business plan she was developing for a photography studio. They seemed to assume that taking 2 weeks of emergency leave meant I was now available for extended family duty. They didn't understand that I would be returning to responsibilities that were waiting for me, that my absence from the Pentagon had created work that needed to be caught up, that I had professional obligations that couldn't be indefinitely postponed. When I explained that I needed to return to Washington immediately, the familiar disappointment surfaced. "But you just got here," my mother protested. "Can't you stay a few more days? The family needs time together." "Mom, I took emergency leave for Grandpa's funeral. I have to get back to work." "What's so important that it can't wait? How do you explain that you're briefing the Deputy Secretary of Defense on NATO alliance strategy? How do you convey that your analysis might influence American foreign policy decisions that affect millions of people? How do you make someone understand that your work matters on a scale they've never considered?" "It's just important," I said, falling back on the vague responses I'd learned to use with family. The flight back to Washington was somber, not just because of grief over my grandfather's death, but because of frustration over my family's continued inability to see me clearly. I had just spent 2 weeks demonstrating the military values of honor, duty, and sacrifice by dropping everything to be present during a family crisis. I had shown them what service looks like when it really matters, and yet, within days, they were back to treating me like their on-call problem solver, someone whose real work couldn't possibly be as important as whatever they needed help with. I returned to the Pentagon carrying my grandfather's folded flag and a renewed sense of purpose. The NATO summit preparation had continued in my absence, but my colleagues had saved the most critical analysis work for my return. They needed my expertise, my perspective, my contributions to decisions that would shape international security policy. As I dove back into work that actually mattered, I realized something profound. My grandfather's death had reminded me why I served, and why that service was valuable even if my family couldn't understand it. I didn't need their validation to know that my work had meaning, that my sacrifices were worthwhile, that my career was building something significant. I also realized that their pattern of taking me for granted had reached a breaking point. I had just made the ultimate sacrifice for family, dropping everything to be present during our darkest hour, and within hours, they were back to assuming I was available for their convenience, dismissing my professional obligations as less important than their personal needs. Something had to change. I couldn't keep being the family member who gave everything and received nothing but expectations for more. I couldn't keep pretending that their inability to understand my life was my responsibility to fix. My grandfather had seen me clearly, had understood what I was building, had been proud of what I was becoming. His recognition meant more to me than years of family indifference, and his death marked the end of my willingness to minimize myself for people who would never appreciate the truth. The next time they asked me to solve their problems, they were going to discover that their most reliable resource had other priorities. The breaking point came exactly 18 months after my grandfather's funeral, on a crisp October morning in 2019. I was in my Pentagon office, reviewing intelligence, briefings for an upcoming meeting with the Joint Chiefs of Staff, when my phone rang with my sister Anna's number. I almost didn't answer because I was deep in preparation for what would be one of the most important presentations of my military career, but some ingrained family loyalty made me pick up. "Sofia, thank God you're available." Anna's voice was breathless, with panic. "We have a major family emergency, and we need you to come home immediately." My stomach tightened with familiar dread. "What happened? Is someone hurt?" "It's the reunion. Our family reunion. Everything is falling apart, and Mom is having a complete breakdown. The venue canceled on us 3 days ago, the caterer disappeared with our deposit, and now we have 85 family members expecting to show up this weekend with nowhere to go and nothing to eat." I stared at my computer screen, where classified intelligence reports about emerging security threats waited for my analysis. In 4 hours, I was scheduled to brief senior military leadership on developments that could affect American foreign policy decisions, but my family wanted me to drop everything to fix their party planning disaster. "Anna, I'm sorry this is stressful, but I can't just leave Washington right now. I have critical meetings scheduled for the rest of the week." "Sofia, you don't understand. This reunion has been planned for 2 years. Great Aunt Esperanza is flying in from Mexico. Uncle Roberto's family is driving from California. This is the first time the entire Martinez family has been together since Grandpa's funeral, and it's all falling apart." The emotional manipulation was masterful and entirely predictable. Frame the situation as a family emergency. Emphasize the scale of the disaster. Invoke the memory of our grandfather. Make it clear that I was the only person capable of solving the problem. Then wait for me to fold, as I always had before. "Have you tried calling other venues? Other caterers?" "Of course we tried." Anna's voice rose to near hysteria. "Everything good is booked months in advance. Mom spent all day yesterday making phone calls and crying. She's convinced the whole family is going to blame her for ruining the reunion." I could picture the scene perfectly. My mother, overwhelmed by a crisis she couldn't solve, probably surrounded by my aunts offering unhelpful suggestions and dramatic predictions of family humiliation. My father, uncomfortable with emotional scenes, probably hiding in his workshop. My cousins busy with their own lives, expecting someone else to swoop in and fix everything. And naturally, all attention had turned to me. "Sofia will know what to do. Sofia can handle logistics. Sofia has connections and organizational skills. Sofia will sacrifice her own obligations to save the family gathering, just like she always does." "Look," I said, trying to keep my voice patient. "I understand this is stressful, but there have to be solutions that don't require me to take emergency leave and fly to Arizona. What about having it at someone's house? What about potluck-style food instead of catering?" "Sofia, you're not listening. We're talking about 85 people. Nobody's house is big enough. And you know how the family is about appearances. We can't just throw together some backyard barbecue and call it a reunion. This was supposed to be elegant, special, memorable. There it was, the real issue. This wasn't about bringing the family together. It was about maintaining appearances, about throwing the kind of event that would generate the right photos for social media and give everyone something impressive to talk about. The actual gathering was less important than the production value. Anna, I'm sorry, but I can't help this time. I have work commitments that I cannot break or reschedule. The silence that followed was loaded with disbelief and accusation. What? Work commitments could possibly be more important than family? How do you explain to someone that you're briefing the Joint Chiefs of Staff on emerging threats to national security? How do you convey that your analysis might influence decisions about military deployments, international alliances, and responses to potential conflicts? How do you make someone understand that your work literally affects the safety and security of millions of people? You don't, because they wouldn't believe you even if you tried. They're just important, Anna. I'm sorry. This is unbelievable. Mom is having a nervous breakdown. The entire family is depending on us to figure this out, and you're going to abandon us because of some paperwork? Some paperwork. 21 years of military service, a master's degree in international relations, a position at the Pentagon that most officers spend their entire careers hoping to achieve. And to my family, it was all just some paperwork. I'm not abandoning anyone. I'm telling you that I cannot leave Washington this week. If you want suggestions or advice, I'm happy to help with that over the phone. Suggestions? Sofia, we don't need suggestions. We need someone who can actually fix this mess. Someone who knows how to organize events and deal with vendors and handle crises. We need you here, in person, working on this full-time until it's solved. The entitlement was breathtaking. They needed me to work full-time on their problem, but my actual full-time work was dismissible whenever it conflicted with their needs. They required my immediate, undivided attention for their crisis, but they had never shown similar urgency or interest when I had achieved promotions, received commendations, or been selected for prestigious assignments. I can't do that, Anna. Fine. Her voice turned cold with disappointment and anger. I guess we know where your priorities are. I guess the military really has changed you into someone who doesn't care about family anymore. She hung up before I could respond, leaving me staring at my phone in a mixture of frustration and relief. Part of me felt guilty, the same part that had been trained over decades to prioritize family peace over personal boundaries. But a larger part felt liberated, maybe for the first time in my adult life. 10 minutes later, my mother called. Mija, Anna told me you can't help with the reunion crisis. I don't understand. This is family. This is important. Mom, my work is also important, but it's just your job, Sofia. Jobs can wait. Family can't. Just my job. A career that had taken me around the world, earned me the respect of senior military leadership, and positioned me to influence decisions that affected international security. Just my job. My work doesn't wait, Mom. I have responsibilities that other people are depending on me to fulfill. What responsibilities could be more important than your own family? I closed my eyes and made a decision that had been building for years. I was done trying to explain my life to people who were determined not to understand it. I was done minimizing my achievements to make them comfortable with their inability to recognize what I had accomplished. I was done being their crisis management service while they dismissed everything that actually mattered to me. I'm sorry about the reunion situation, but I can't help. You'll have to figure it out without me. Sofia Elena Martinez, I cannot believe you would abandon your family like this. After everything we've done for you, after all the support we've given you over the years, this is how you repay us? The revisionist history was stunning. What support had they given me? When had they celebrated my achievements, encouraged my ambitions, or shown interest in my actual life? They had spent 2 decades treating me like their personal problem-solving service, and now they were claiming that I owed them for their support? Mom, I have to go. I have a meeting to prepare for. A meeting. A meeting is more important than your family's crisis. Yes, I said quietly. This meeting is more important than your party planning crisis. I hung up and turned off my phone. For the rest of that week, I threw myself into my work with renewed focus and energy. The intelligence briefings I prepared were thorough and insightful. The presentation I delivered to the Joint Chiefs was well received and led to follow-up discussions about policy recommendations. My analysis contributed to decisions that would shape American military strategy for years to come, and I felt no guilt about choosing this meaningful work over my family's self-created drama. The family reunion happened without me, and according to the explosion of angry text messages I received afterward, it was indeed a disaster. They ended up having it in my Aunt Isabella's backyard with food from 3 different chain restaurants. The photos on social media showed a chaotic gathering that looked nothing like the elegant event they had envisioned. My mother's message was particularly bitter. I hope you're happy with your choice. The whole family knows you abandoned us when we needed you most. Great Aunt Esperanza kept asking where you were, and I had to tell her that your job was more important than family. Everyone is very disappointed in you. But mixed in with the angry messages were a few that surprised me. My cousin Elena, whose wedding I had saved years earlier, sent a thoughtful text. I know everyone's upset about the reunion, but I hope you know some of us understand that you have important work to do. Thanks for everything you've done for this family over the years. My nephew David, now in college, sent a message that made me smile. Heard you're doing big things in Washington. That's awesome, Aunt Sofia. Sorry the family's being dramatic about the reunion. Even my grandmother, my grandfather's widow, called to tell me she wasn't angry. Your grandfather would understand, mija. He always said duty comes first, even when it's hard. Those few messages of support meant more to me than years of conditional family acceptance. They came from people who understood that I was building something significant, that my choices had value beyond their ability to solve everyone else's problems. 3 weeks after the reunion disaster, I received notification that I had been promoted to colonel. The ceremony was scheduled for the following month, and for the first time in years, I didn't even consider inviting my family to attend. They had made it clear that they didn't understand or value my military career, so why would they want to celebrate a milestone they couldn't appreciate? Instead, I invited my grandfather's widow, my cousin Elena, and my nephew David. I also invited Colonel Hayes, who had become both a mentor and a friend, and several colleagues who had supported my career development. The promotion ceremony was everything my family's drama wasn't: dignified, meaningful, and focused on genuine achievement rather than superficial appearances. When the new rank insignia were pinned to my uniform, I thought about my grandfather and how proud he would have been to see this moment. 6 months later, I was selected to be the keynote speaker at the Southwest Regional Veterans Excellence Awards. The invitation came because of my work in international security policy, my humanitarian service record, and my advocacy for veteran educational opportunities. It was recognition from the veteran community that my career had meaning and impact beyond anything my family had ever acknowledged. When I learned that the ceremony would be broadcast to community centers across the region, including the one where my family held their annual reunion, I smiled. After decades of being invisible to them, of having my achievements dismissed and my work minimized, they were about to see me exactly as I was, not as their disappointing relative who had never lived up to her potential, but as Colonel Sofia Elena Martinez, a leader whose service had earned respect from people who understood what excellence actually looked like. They had spent years telling me I had peaked in high school, that I was wasting my potential, that I should come home and build a real life like everyone else. They were about to discover that while they were planning reunions and managing local drama, their family disappointment had been building something extraordinary. The girl who had supposedly peaked at 18 was about to address thousands of veterans as a recognized leader in her field. The relative who never seemed to amount to anything was about to be honored for achievements they had never bothered to learn about. Tomorrow night, they would finally see me clearly, not through the lens of their limitations and expectations, but as the person I had been becoming all along while they weren't paying attention. And I couldn't wait to watch their faces when they realized that their biggest disappointment had become their greatest success, entirely without their knowledge, support, or approval. If you've ever been underestimated by the people who should know you best, if you've ever had your achievements dismissed by family members who can't see beyond their own narrow definitions of success, then you know exactly how this moment felt. Sometimes the most satisfying victories are the ones that happen in full view of people who never believed you could achieve them. Don't forget to subscribe to hear more stories about finding your strength, setting boundaries, and proving wrong. The people who underestimated you. Your journey matters, and your achievements deserve recognition, even if it doesn't come from the people you expected.